So put us on gallery view, and I believe we're live now.
Looks like it.
Right when I have to clear my throat. I'm here. Hey, hi everyone. I'm Emil Guillermo, your museum director of the Filipino American National Historical Museum. That's my gong. I am in my closet. Of course, I'm in my closet. I've got to be in my closet. I'm a Filipino in the closet, but it's a good kind of closet. This is a good kind of gong. You're supposed to imagine it ringing. Anyway, we're here, another FANHS Museum virtual pop-up, and the person joining me on the screen, if you see us in gallery mode, is Jennifer Fergesen, who is an award-winning food writer. She won a Player Del Award over the weekend, and she'll be talking with us here on this pop-up. Hi, Jennifer.
Hi. Thanks for
Hi.
having me here.
Yeah, it's good. It's good to have another person. You know, these solo things. And look, we're both wearing red. That's total coincidence. I didn't say wear red today or anything like that. But by golly, you're wearing red.
I
So
always say you should wear a bright color in a Zoom meeting, so I've been told to wear red all the time.
is that what you
Yeah.
know? I heard that too. I thought it was only during Easter or something that you should wear red.
I have even a red mug to match.
Yeah, or if you're good, I have nothing else that's red here in my closet, unfortunately, except a Christmas hat. Anyway, look, we're this is a special day. Jennifer's going to be along for the ride. I'm going to talk to her about her award-winning piece. You know, we had something called This Week in Filipino American History, and it's taken from the FANHS calendar. And I just want to mention a couple of things that are important to mention on this week in Filipino American history. On the 24th, for example, because and these are things that happen, we forget because we think we're in a modern time. And the 24th, there was an anti-Filipino riot in Exeter, California in 1929, which indicates how well respected Filipinos were. They had these riots about us. That's how much they enjoyed our company. That happened on October 24th. Also on this day, and this isn't important too, because you have to remember the importance of Filipinos on the world stage here in America. And on October 24th, United Nations Day, Filipino Carlos P. Romulo was elected the first Secretary General of the UN in 1947. That's on October 24th. So funny how the highs and lows of one day. On this day, and last couple of times we've done these pop-ups, I've forgotten to do This Week in Filipino American History because we've been talking about Filipino American history. And this, in fact, is October Filipino American History Month. I bet you knew that, Jennifer, right?
Yeah, of course.
Yeah, and everyone, how many times have you been stopped and people have said, "Oh, it's Happy Filipino American History"? Have some people stopped you and said that to you?
Never. In fact, every October I try to pitch a story to my editors about doing something about Filipinos in the area, Filipino History Month, and everyone's like, nobody knows what that is.
Oh, Jennifer, you just messed up my setup. You were supposed to say, of course, everyone's stopping me at the grocery store if they're not locked down. Of course. All right, look, it may not have happened to you, but it's happening to me. I'm getting stopped a lot by people who say, man, maybe it's because they're in the museum biz or, they are in the ethnic news biz, and they'll say, hey, happy Filipino American History Month. And so I think it's becoming a thing, but it only becomes a thing if we keep talking about it, and not just in October, but every day. Every day we got to talk about this, right? So on October 24th, the highs and lows. Carlos Romulo, Filipino in America, elected, Secretary General of the UN. Carlos, and how many people know that there's a Romulo Street in San Francisco? It's a little alley. But Carlos Romulo was a big deal, and yet you don't have people walking around saying, hey, Carlos Romulo, I want to be like him. Although you should. People should. He was a great man, Carlos Romulo. And then on that very day, October 24th, the 1929 anti-Filipino riots in Exeter, which is a town in the Central Valley of California. And of course, there are anti-Filipino riots they did not like Filipinos in 1929. Remember that. Don't ever forget that. The Filipinos were brought over to be a labor force. They weren't exactly slaves, they were American nationals. But when you work for $1 a day, that's not exactly slave wages. Well, it's not exactly slavery, but it is slave wages, working $1 a day in the fields. And you think that the next person I want to mention in This Week in Filipino History, Larry Itliong, when he went on strike in the grape strikes, the workers there were battling for, they were trying to get $1.40 an hour. They were at $1.15. That's progress, right? Larry Itliong, we remember him. His birthday is today, October 25th. We talked about him yesterday. With Alex Idilior. Alex grew up in Delano, lives in Bakersfield. He was on the show. If you missed the program, catch it on our Facebook at Filipino Museum, or FANHS, FANHS Museum, Facebook at FANHS Museum. Go to the live section or go to the middle. There's a number of posts, videos where my talk with Alex is there. Catch it. He talks all about Larry Itliong. Go to the Facebook Live page on our Facebook page, and you'll see all the other pop-ups we've done. And I did one other one with Alex back in September. So catch that and learn the importance of Larry Itliong. Today is his birthday. He came here in 1929, I believe, a year after my father. My father came in 1928. And just imagine, 1929, he came here in the Valley, and they had these anti-Filipino riots in Exeter in 1929. The Filipinos came here as nationals because they thought the streets were lined with gold, right? They thought this was their land of opportunity. And they came just in time for the Depression and anti-Filipino riots in the Valley, where they would seek to find their opportunity, many of them. That's Filipino American history. So Larry Itliong's birthday today. I will say this. I won this Plaridel Award also this weekend. The Plaridel, and it's the reason why we have Jennifer here with us. Jennifer, congratulations on that Plaridel Award.
Thank you. It was really an honor.
Yeah, and the Plaridel is to honor Filipino American media. It's given by the Filipino American Press Club. It's important from an historical basis because it tells a Filipino story, the Filipino American story. And I say this a lot, journalism is the first draft of history. And if you look at the journalists who look back in time to try to figure out, well, what happened back then? What become their primary sources in lieu of actual living people who can tell them, hey, this is what happened. The primary sources are the secondary sources, the first drafts, the journalism of the day. And there were tons of Filipino American papers that were put out by the people who first came to America, right here in San Francisco, Sacramento, up and down the valley, throughout the nation. And I'm proud to say that for the much of my journalism career, even though I've had some mainstream success, the best stories I've ever done were the stories I did for the ethnic press, the Asian American press and Asian Week in San Francisco, the Filipino American press when I wrote from Filipinas when it was good, and also for all the other Filipino publications. I wrote for the Filipino Express in Jersey, for goodness sakes. Jennifer, did you ever read the Filipino Express out of Jersey City?
I've definitely seen it. It's by the checkout stand at every single Filipino grocery store.
Now, you were probably a young girl when I was writing for that paper, but it had the blue banner, Filipino Express, and those blocky letters. Right. I wrote for the Filipino Express in Jersey. At the same time, I was writing for the the Philippine News in San Francisco. the Filipino ethnic press is a vibrant press. And this is where Filipino Americans get their news, their balitang. And so when the Filipino American Press Club gives its awards, I'm, it's the call to like submit your stuff, buddy. If you got something good, and I'm honored, always honored to have received another one of these. Not a, this is one for, I wrote in 2018, but I've run about 6 or 7 of them. It never gets old. It always is meaningful because it always means that when the ball is coming, you're hitting it soundly and squarely, and you're hitting it hopefully over the fence or far or where no one's catching it. Or actually, if you're writing, everyone's better be catching it and understanding it. So much for that metaphor. But you are hitting the ball. You are in the game, right? And you are telling Filipinos, other Filipino Americans, that we are in the game. That's the importance of the Philippine American media. That's the importance of the Player-Del Awards. Now, Jennifer, I'm going to get to your story. Honest to God.
Take your time.
But thank you for that confirmation of the New Jersey Filipino Express, because I just wanted to see their reach, and they had great stories in the Philippines. I mean, besides carrying my column, they'd always cover the latest trip to Lourdes by the pilgrimage to Lourdes by the faithful. I mean, typical Filipino American kind of thing, right? Strong on religion, spirituality, but also they allowed for my column to get in. So the column that I won 2 awards. I won one for best commentary and one for best news story. The best news story was on the Filipino nurses who are fighting COVID-19. But the other story, and the one that I guess I'm proudest of, is the commentary where I wrote about Larry Itliong. And I just want to read you a little bit of that today because it's just it's about Larry. It's about Larry. So I said the title, it ran in the Inquirer.net on PBS's Asian American series and Larry Itliong's Price. It ran on May 22nd of this year. And I said, if you saw the PBS documentary Asian Americans, then you get a big gulp of history over 2 days. And there was even Filipino parts with my radar going off in the beginning. The whole shebang kicks off with the personal story of an ancestor of one of the Igorots brought to the U.S. to be part of the exhibition at the 1904 World's Fair, a shameful human zoo. It is a terrible and immoral an origin story as it gets for Asian Americans. That's the Filipino contribution. We were colonized, then brought over as entertainment to sell American imperialism. Funny how you don't see it much taught in history classes in America, that 1904 World's Fair experience. When I was at Harvard, there were no published books at stores. I had to go deep into the stacks to find unpublished theses written by visiting Filipino scholars. That's how disinterested America is in its moral screw-ups. So it was nice to see the PBS treatment of Asian Americans start with the indignity of the World's Fair. And then to see other Filipinos included, like professors Daniel Phil Gonzalez, you've seen him on the show, Alex Fabros, who is recovering from an illness, and we've wanted him on the show. He hasn't been on yet, but we're going to get him. They're both from San Francisco State's College of Ethnic Studies. But the producers chose Larry Itliong, the late labor leader, to be the Filipino poster boy for the documentary's PR materials. Now, it's about time that Itliong, the man who actually started the grape strike in Delano of 1965, got out from under the shadow of Cesar Chavez. Now, I've written about Itliong in columns previously. I've talked about him previously, but it remained the dirty little secret of one of the key events in labor and civil rights history. Still does. Itliong was a heck of a leader and a speaker. In fact, it's too bad he's not around to do a few commencement speeches. remember, I wrote this in May, right? He died of Lou Gehrig's disease in 1977. A few years ago, a tape surfaced of a talk that Itliong gave to students at UC Santa Cruz in 1976. If Chavez was si se puede, yes, we can, then Itliong can be remembered as the man who was fearless for saying no. No. On the tape, he talked about being offered big money to do things for the powerful in American society, big labor, big politicians. A lot want to buy me off, Itliong said to the students. One of the organizations that I grew up with in this country offered me $200,000. Itliong described a deal with conditions that included helping Cesar Chavez run the service center in the fields. It was after Itliong decided to leave the United Farm Workers as a VP to Chavez that big labor wanted him to stay. You know what I tell him? He said, I don't need that $200,000. I can eat rice and pusit, squid, bogong, mango. I don't need 200,000. The students were amazed by this refusal. I said 200,000 to sell out my countrymen? Itliong asked rhetorically. I figure we have about 350,000 Filipinos in California. That's only 200,000. That's not even $1 a head. No, I don't want your money. I want to sell my countrymen. If I want to sell them, then give me 50 million. I'll take it. So Itliong did name his price. But as he told the story, he laughed with the students in the seminar. Do you want me to buy my countrymen? Give me 50 million? Itliong said it wasn't an isolated instance either. They tried to buy me many times, Itliong said on the tape. We could use a leader like that today, Filipino or not. At the very least, he'd be a great commencement speaker. Now, the piece goes on. I talk about 2020, the class of 2020, and I give the commencement speech that I would have given to anybody if they'd asked me. God, last commencement speech I gave was to my high school, Lowell High School in San Francisco years ago. But the piece ends with mask up, class of 2020. Watch out for saliva-bearing plosives. Life is not your spittoon. Just keep your distance from stupid, selfish politics that divide us. And don't wait for perfection before acting. Perfect the imperfect as you go. It will keep you active and moving forward. Good luck. We're counting on you like never before for your hope and idealism. Keep your price tag high. Larry Itliong did. So that was the commentary that won the Plaridel Award, and very pleased to have been honored and pleased to be able to share with you here on our pop-up. I'll share it with you also on the chat afterwards, so you can link and read it yourself. And you can delete the my Filipino accent if you wish. Like I said, that's just my way of connecting with my forebears, because my father was Ilocano, my mother was Tagalog, so I did come from a mestizo background. But the accent, because they couldn't speak the language, each other's language, they spoke English in this accented way. So anyway, that was my Plaridel story this week in Filipino American history. Now, I welcome my guest, Jennifer Fergesen. You one of Plaridel, and it was a great. I mean, I saw one of the pieces. I wasn't able to access the other piece, but I'm sure it was good.
Thank you.
You're a food writer. Tell me about what's your interest in food?
Sure. Well, I mean, my interest in food started out being the same interest everyone has in food. I really love to eat. But at some point, I mean, my two passions, I guess, are writing and food. And at some point, I realized that the ekphrasis, the translation of the sensory experience of eating to writing, is kind of the most intellectually stimulating form of writing that I could find. So from like sixth grade, I really loved trying to be able to translate, say, a bite of dumpling or something onto paper, all the textures, all the sensations, all the emotions and memories that it evokes. So really, ever since then, I've really been into food writing. I like wrote a food column for my middle school newspaper, high school newspaper, and college and grad schools when I really started writing as a food writer professionally.
Now that's something. Middle school food writer.
Yeah.
You just don't hear that. Well, I prefer this lollipop to that, or I prefer this I Slurpee, the best Slurpee or icy. The icy Slurpee debate. I mean,
Oh, I was a very sophisticated eater as a middle schooler, I think. I never took a kids menu from when I was like 6 years up.
there it is. Your epitaph will be, she never took a kid's menu.
Right.
Well, that's interesting because food. When it comes to food, food is this tactile thing, right? And writing about it is interesting, to try to convey what you're feeling. But I always thought the metaphor for well, with writing, to be closer to liquid form, like water and libations, and but yeah, it's all connected. So the Filipino in you, where does that come in?
Sure. Well, my mom is Filipino, and growing up in New Jersey, although you had the newspaper that you wrote for and everything, really in my community, New Jersey, there was nothing resembling Filipino culture. I think my mom and I were probably the only Filipinos in the entire town when they did the census, like 0.02% Filipino. That was just us. And so I guess my town was mostly Italian, and I kind of fit in physically that way because just having dark hair and coming from New Jersey, everyone assumes that you're Italian. But I really wanted to find a way that I stood out. So I think that's why I kind of gravitated towards learning about my Filipino heritage.
Yeah.
And really, because my mom didn't cook, she didn't teach me Tagalog, she wasn't really that interested in Filipino culture herself.
Yeah.
My closest connection to Filipino culture was through restaurants. So I asked my parents, like, drive me around the whole, Tri-County region looking for Filipino restaurants and experiencing the culture that way.
Wow, that's funny because you said there's a lot of Italians, so that you're in New Jersey, which is the land of Tony Soprano. So
Right, exactly.
if you heard the term "bada bing," you might think, "Oh, Bedoya," or "babinka." No, "bada bing," but that's something else, something totally different. Than so it must have been strange to. How did Filipino food translate in Jersey? I look, I know in the southern part, well, not Jersey City is not the southern part, but it's south of where you were.
Mhm.
South Jersey's more like Remsen or Freehold or someplace like that, or someplace on the shore. But how did Filipino food translate in your mostly white enclave there in Jersey?
Yeah, well, there are Filipino enclaves in New Jersey, and that's where we went to get the foods. Like, there's this nice place, I think it's in Ridgewood is the name of the town. It was called Bamboo Grill, and they had really excellent crispy pata and all the different kinds of dishes I like. But everyone in the kitchen actually was Mexican, so I feel like they put a little bit of their own flavors and spin into the food. There's a lot of overlap, actually.
Yeah, well, yes, because of Spain, and there's a lot. One thing I realized through this, this post here when I do the museum, the British were in the Philippines briefly.
Mhm.
They didn't stay there. And because the British and the Spanish were sort of vying for imperial power, the British went elsewhere. They were in India. They were trying to get to Hong Kong and China. They weren't interested in the Philippines. But can you imagine the food choices if the British had prevailed beyond Manila and throughout the Philippines? I mean, we'd be eating bangers and mash in a local pub somewhere in Taga in Ilocos or someplace.
Maybe, but I mean, the British are the ones who brought Japanese curry to Japan. So I mean, it's really a Britishized Indian curry that's became popular there. So maybe that would become popular in the Philippines.
Yeah, we'd have British curried adobo.
Yeah, that'd be great.
Yeah, well, look, as a food writer,
Mhm.
you're known to go to these far-flung places, and your Plaridel Award actually was a win for a piece you did on traveling to Georgia. And
Mhm.
I don't mean the Georgia of our American South. I mean the Georgia as in over there, like,
Right.
you know, in the former Soviet Union.
Mhm.
So what are Filipinos in that part of Georgia, what are they eating? And are they eating authentic Filipino food?
Yeah, Georgia is an interesting case. So, most of the places that I visited are places where Filipinos have settled permanently in large numbers, but Georgia is actually not that case. There's one Filipino restaurant in Tbilisi, which is the capital of Georgia, and it's run by a tourist company. So it's like attached to a hostel, basically.
Uh,
And Georgia is actually a hotspot for Filipinos who are working in the Gulf region. It's not very far from those Gulf countries. You can easily get a direct flight from Abu Dhabi, Dubai, all those sorts of cities. But it stands out because it's a Christian country, and therefore you can eat pork. So, according to the chef of this little restaurant in Tbilisi, Filipinos will come to his restaurant who have been living in, say, Abu Dhabi, where they couldn't eat pork for 10 years, and then just order every single pork dish they have on their menu. So they have crispy pata, they have sisig, really good sisig, one of the best I've had, and just like buckle down and eat as much as they can to kind of, I guess, save up for the next fast.
so wait a minute now. This is I when I got to that part in your piece, and
Mhm.
I was in. I just remembered. Yeah, there's Muslims in that area, and there are Christians, and the Muslims do not eat pork, and the Christians revel in it,
Mhm.
and so that there's no potential conflict. Or there should be some potential conflict, but how do they bridge that gap?
In
So,
Georgia?
yeah.
Well, Georgia, um, Orthodox Christianity is basically their state religion. It's almost entirely Christian, but they are an interesting case because you know where they are on the map. They're surrounded by Muslim countries and then Russia and Ukraine. So they've always been kind of, I guess, a buffer zone, especially for the United States. They're a super important ally in the region. But historically, they have been really welcoming to people of all different backgrounds, and I think that's kind of why they were able to survive. They have this attitude towards hospitality. They're not going to try to force you to follow their religion or force you out if you are of a different religion. And I think that's part of why Filipinos feel comfortable there as well.
Yeah, it sounds very Filipino, right?
Right.
That hospitality. So, God, I can imagine if you're a Filipino and you haven't had pork in a long time, and you're just like, this is like pork central, right? You witness people just really engorging themselves in the crispy pata.
Mhm. Yeah, I did. It was I wrote about in the article, I saw a mother and daughter, quite slim. I don't know how they managed it, but they together ate one crispy pata each, and that was just like the appetizer. But there's much more to eat in Georgia. I think it's really just a beautiful country and very welcoming. And as you say, it has similarities to the Philippines because it's been colonized again and again and again, and yet it has managed to maintain its individual culture.
Now, I did enjoy that piece, but I must say that, I bristle a little bit because I'm a vegan,
Mhm.
but I'm an open-minded vegan, all right, which means that you can tempt me, but I'll just acknowledge that, it's your right to pork out. And I but I did recall reading it. It did, it did dawn on me the Filipinos' love of pork, and how pork is in everything, and which is why a restaurant that serves vegan lechon is a real, it sticks out. There is one I know in in the San Francisco Bay Area, but uh, I guess it's not exactly a vegan hotspot there. This restaurant, Little Manila, it's called in Tbilisi.
Right, that's true. But if you look at my website, theglobalcalendaria.com, I have visited restaurants that are translating this Filipino cuisine into a more vegan palette. Like there's one that I really loved in Vienna, Austria. It's called Hotel am Brillentengrund. And it's this beautiful vintage hotel that this really cool Austria-born Filipino hipster guy renovated with the help of his mom. His mom runs the kitchen, and together they've created this wonderful entirely vegan Filipino menu. So they make vegan sisig, which is a seitan that they make by hand. So it's a gluten-based meat substitute. They have tofu sisig. They have these really wonderful vegetable siopao. And that was honestly some of the best Filipino food I've had anywhere, vegan or not. So it can definitely be translated. I mean, if you look in the countryside of the Philippines, it's mostly vegetable based. I really think that side of Filipino cuisine should be valorized more outside of the country.
Yeah, that's the truth. I mean, when you say Filipino, it's in terms of cuisine, it's not so much the meat medium. It's really the spices. It's really the flavors that contribute to the taste. And sometimes the meat, whether it's pork or chicken or beef or fish, just gets in the way. I mean, it could just as easily be, as you point out, seitan. Could just as easily be tofu. It could just as easily be just the vegetables to give you or to carry to you the Filipino taste. And what would you say is that Filipino taste? What combination of spices besides garlic says this is Filipino?
Mhm. Yeah, well, there's a line in that article that won the Player Del this year. I said it's the syzygy of sweet, sour, and savory. So it's something about that. There's definitely the emphasis on acidity is something unique to Filipino cuisine, I think. But of course, we have our own trinity. In French cuisine, their trinity is the celery, carrot, and onion. But in Filipino cuisine, it would definitely be onion, garlic, and ginger. Don't you think? They always start with that.
Yeah, onion, garlic, and ginger, and then you got to put the soy in there, right? The
Right.
soy sauce, right? And then that's like everything tastes the same, right? Whatever it is, I cook my pancit out of whatever noodles. It doesn't have to be the bihon. It could be the a vermicelli, or it could be like a any kind of noodle. But if you saute it in a base of basically onion and garlic and soy sauce, maybe with a little, patis, a little thing of patis, and then you top it all off with some kind of the acid, right? The lemon. There it
Mhm.
is.
I have a feeling really that attitude towards Filipino taste is unique to the diaspora because I mean, when you're in the Philippines, especially in the countryside, there's much less seasoning. It's much more about the flavor of the fresh vegetables and foraged fish and things like that. But these ingredients, patis, soy sauce, coconut vinegar, these are things that can easily be exported. So in any Filipino grocery in the entire world, even this tiny little one that I went to in the Faroe Islands, you can find those ingredients, you can apply them to whatever you happen to have around you, and you can get that familiar Filipino taste. But really, I think that's the taste of the diaspora more than it is the taste of the Philippines itself.
Yeah, the taste of the people who want the taste.
Right.
Right, where it's the taste of the people seeking what's Filipino, when in fact, if you're in the Philippines, you would taste it because you would just be picking it off the trees or it would be fresh.
Mhm.
You would be the freshness of whatever it is that's growing there. But the saluyot, I don't know what would it be. But all right, so tell me, in your travels, you the the story that I didn't get to that I want you to talk about, that won for best international story. Now I won best news story, but you won best international story, and I'm sure it's because you write about food, but you also wrote about, there was this news aspect to it. It's how Filipino restaurateurs are dealing with COVID
Mhm.
and trying, how are they dealing with the situation and managing to get Filipino taste out wherever they are.
Right. So that's kind of the pivot that I've done from the pandemic. I mean, everybody has their pandemic pivot. And for me, I was planning to continue traveling around, visiting restaurants and talking to them one-on-one in their own space. But for this piece that won the Best International Story, which I really was surprised to receive, because as you mentioned, I am a food writer, not really an international journalist, although I'd like to be. But for this piece, what I did was I called a lot of the restaurants that I had spoken to previously in Europe, and also a few that I hadn't been to before in Italy, because Italy was at the time the epicenter of the pandemic in March. And I just talked to them in the middle of my night, how they were adapting, like what they were seeing on the ground. And I really think that this offered a more nuanced picture of what the pandemic actually looked like in Europe than these endlessly scrolling ticker numbers that everyone was looking at, number of deaths, number of sicknesses. So I talked to restaurateurs for this piece in Italy, Hungary, Iceland.
Iceland.
Yeah, Iceland. Iceland's where I started this project, actually. So I spoke to not exactly a restaurateur, she's a caterer that I had met previously the year before.
Yeah, I know, there are surprisingly at least one or two Filipino restaurants in Iceland I know of.
Yes, I think there may have been more since I was last there, but yeah, at the time there was only one, and it was actually now it would be about 30 years old, almost 30 years old. And that's the first place I ever wrote about. I ended up starting this story actually because I was in Iceland on a whim in 2018. I just went there because, if you remember at the time, WOW Air was offering bizarrely cheap flights between New York and Newark actually, and Reykjavik, $300 round trip, amazing. So I just went there and I ended up meeting the managing editor of the largest English language newspaper there. That's the kind of thing that happens in Iceland, such a small place. You'll end up meeting the person you're meant to meet. And so he invited me to pitch a story, anything really I was interested in. Of course, I'm interested in Filipino food. So I discovered that there was one Filipino restaurant at that time existing in the entire country in Borganes, which is a little village, a couple hours north of the main city. So it's not even in Reykjavik. So that summer, I traveled back to Iceland. I spent a couple weeks going up to Borganes, talking to the restaurateur, learning her story, and writing the story for the Reykjavik Grapevine. And it later got picked up by Positively Filipino, which is through whom I got the Plaridel.
Yeah.
So pretty much ever since then, I guess I was so fascinated by that woman's story that I realized that every single Filipino restaurant around the world must have a story that interesting. I mean, she basically escaped the chaos that came after the end of the military dictatorship. She was trying to get some peace after that. And yeah, we talked for 3 hours, and it's been similar with every single restaurateur I met. We'd sit down and talk for a whole day and learn their whole life story. And so it was great to catch up with them again, on the phone at least, for this piece about their response to the pandemic.
And what I want to get back to the storytelling part, but what are the challenges of the pandemic? I would imagine right off the bat, people aren't going to the restaurants as frequently or as much as they were before, right?
Right. Yeah, of course. I mean, it's the case for restaurants all around the world, Filipino or anything else. There's estimates that 20 to 40%, depending on the country, of restaurants will close permanently because of this. Of course, people aren't going out to eat. They also have less money to spend. They're concerned about whether or not they can get sick through eating food that's made by someone they don't know. There's many reasons why restaurants aren't doing well right now. A few have been able to, adapt to this whole new online way of living we have now, get on all the delivery platforms and avoid their gouging fees. But I mean, a lot of these Filipino restaurants are from the previous generation. They're not used to that kind of platform. And yeah, they really have had a hard time catching up.
Well, a lot of times also with Filipino food, I mean, if you're in a far-flung place, you're dealing with a market that's a small market to begin with. And, unless you're appealing to that broad market, it's going to be tough. If you appeal to just the Filipinos, well, some Filipinos maybe they're on the front lines anyway, and they don't mind going out there to eat. But a lot of Filipinos might say, well, I can just cook at home, right? There's that there's that mentality that says, well, I can cook my my saluyot or my pancit or my whatever, you know, I can goat. It would be hard to make goat on your own. Although I guess you could,
Good.
Papi, I guess you could if you had to, not a vegan one, but you know, I just think it'd be kind of tough for those Filipino restaurateurs to hang in there.
Yeah.
Uh, did are they going to? Do you think they're going to survive? Do you think they're going to stay in business?
It definitely depends on the restaurant. But after writing this piece that got the Plaridel, I've basically been covering exactly that through numerous stories about how restaurants are pivoting to survive what's going on and also how they're trying to support others. So in San Francisco, actually, there's this business called Sarap Shop, I believe is their name. They're originally a food truck, although they have a brick and mortar now. And the co-owner, the the woman in the pair, she's actually previously an executive coach. So she knows a lot about business and how to help other businesses get what they need to continue. So she's put together this sort of toolkit that she's giving to restaurateurs, especially from the previous generation who aren't used to online stuff, to help them get on board. And she's also used her own online selling platform to let other companies sell their products. So there's people who are supporting each other, and I think that's really going to, the success of the Filipino food scene in general is going to depend on that, on this sort of inter-restaurant support.
Yeah, a lot has to a lot, you know, it depends on how quickly you can adapt to this new online world,
Mhm.
how you can do things online. Like I like to call this Sunday brunch, but clearly I'm not serving any food, but we're talking about food today and people have to bring their own food. But it tries to replicate what the kind of conversation you might have at a Sunday brunch, perhaps. But let's talk about the kind of stories that you uncovered or you found when you talk to these restaurant owners, because it's kind of fascinating that everyone does have a story, and there is a kind of an historic sense about that story because it's usually history that makes them move. It's history that forces them to move, and they bring with them the food, and there you have, when you're breaking bread with these people, you have the opportunity to share the story of both the history with the food right there in person.
Mhm.
So what's been the most fascinating stories, Filipino stories that you've encountered over food?
Sure. Well, I would say in the past year, the stories that really interested me most were those that I learned for a piece I wrote about the Faroe Islands, which, if you're not familiar, is this little group of islands that's in between Iceland and the UK.
Right.
It belongs to Denmark, but it's self-governing. And it's very remote and very cold, and there's very little there. And yet, Filipinos are actually the largest immigrant group in this country of like 50,000 people.
Wow,
And
the largest immigration group to the Faroe Island. I guess islanders are attracted to islands, I guess, huh?
well, yes, and actually, there's a specific reason for it. They're almost entirely women. And the Faroe Islands has an issue with women largely moving away because most of the jobs that are available are fishing on fishing boats or they're marine based jobs. Basically, they're very heavy manual labor jobs that a lot of women don't really want to do. So they'll go to the mainland, and that leaves men without anyone to get married to.
Ah,
So there's been a huge movement, I guess, and since about the early 2000s of men going online to look for wives. And they use these websites, which previously were called things like filipinaheart.com. It's kind of the modern version of mail order brides, but it's interesting in that it's initiated by the woman. So if you use these websites, you can't like message a woman if you like her face or something. They have to message you, and that's because the Philippines passed a law against mail order brides. That's their way of getting around it. But so there's an enormous number of these women now in the Faroe Islands,
well,
and
this is, excuse me, this is kind
yeah,
of fascinating though, because here in America, a lot of women, Filipino Americans, are here because of this mail order bride,
for sure.
you know, I don't know how, what do you call it? The mail order bride phenomenon, you know, where whether it's legal, illegal, it happens.
Mhm.
pen early on it was pen pals, and then it was, then I guess I guess that was sort of the facade, right? Start writing to them, and then,
Yeah.
but you're essentially, it's guaranteed because payments were exchanged, and here it is. So this is the modern day version, and I guess because of crackdowns in
Mhm.
places like here in the U.S. and even on the part of the Philippines, you're not seeing as many Filipino Americans, although I am sure that more than a handful of people in my audience who are into Filipino American history will say, wow, you know, that's why we're not seeing as many, because we're all going to the Faroe Islands, I guess. Is that?
Yeah, I think that's part of it. But of course, there's a lot of stigma attached to that, and I certainly came to it, I guess, through a lens of stigma, although I tried to hold my judgment, as a journalist. But the more I got to know these women, I realized that I totally had the wrong idea about them. And I think sometimes the men had the wrong idea about them as well. I mean, a lot of times on these websites, Filipinos are marketed as traditional, domestic, all that sort of thing, everything that you want in a 19th century kind of wife. But these women that I met were like very self-determined, very entrepreneurial, and that's how we get into food. There's 3 Filipino restaurants currently in the Faroe Islands. There's no Chinese restaurants. They're probably the largest foreign food available there, other than maybe pizza. Um, and all of them are started by these women who were just bored at home through their like 10-month winter that they have. And they just decided to start their own businesses without any capital, without any business background. They just did it, and they're all amazing, really, really good, um, really popular restaurants. They're feeding mostly Faroese, not other Filipinos. So they really had to translate their menu to their palate, and they've been successful.
Are they starting a new generation of Filipino Faroese?
Yeah, of course. They all have kids, and their kids seem like they're staying connected with the Filipino culture. They're teaching them Tagalog along with Faroese and English. And I'm very jealous because those are 3 very difficult languages. I don't know how they can manage it. Um, and yeah, I guess within 20 years, there might be a new hybrid culture there. So it'll be interesting to see maybe what kind of restaurants they'll start.
So they wouldn't be Vikings there, would they? They would
Well,
be.
yeah, they are.
Oh, they are. So these would be the Viking Filipinos, right?
Right.
So this would be yeah, Thoripinos.
Yeah,
Or
I mean, I'm of partly Nordic descent too, so yeah, I guess I'm a Thorapino.
oh, so when I mentioned in my email that I knew about the Helm of Awe,
Mhm.
because I know about, about the Fafnir the dragon being slayed by Sigurd, and this,
Oh wow.
he steals this thing, this amulet, right? You know about that symbol, right?
I'm not really familiar with it.
Oh, well, it's the Helm of Awe. Come on, get with your Nordic, your Nordicness. Uh, no, my daughter went there and she gave me the Helm of Awe on a like one of those buff scarves, and so of course I just had to take a deep dive into, what is this thing protecting me from? But
Mhm.
no, these Faroese Filipinos or Filipino pharaohs, that sounds almost Middle Eastern, Filipino pharaohs, but they're but they're actually Nordic. Uh, so did they do something to the food to make it different?
Well, yes. What's interesting about their food is that it's almost entirely made of lamb. So in the Faroe Islands, there's like 3 times as many sheep as there are people. And lamb is definitely the cheapest meat available, and I think the tastiest. So they have caldereta made with lamb, they have adobo made with lamb, bulalo, all the different foods made with lamb. And it's delicious, really wonderful, tender, flavorful lamb.
So do they, instead of seeing a porklet or a big, baby pig at a Filipino birthday party, you would see a lamb instead in its place?
Traditionally in the Faroes, they do that. I mean, I happened to
Really?
be,
They do that? They put a lamb's body out on a plate? That's barbaric.
well, for a vegan, yeah, I understand how that would be.
Uh,
But I was at a Filipino kid's birthday party actually in the Faroes, and no, they didn't have anything like that. They just had a lot of pancit.
Pancit with little lamb bits. I get
Yeah, of course.
so God. So and kari instead of oxtail, you'd have lamb's
Mhm,
tail.
mhm. I don't know about the tail,
Really?
it's
You'd
small.
have lamb's
A little
tail?
bit leg.
Ah, okay. The Faroe Islands. Well, good thing COVID's got me locked down here, so I'm not gonna be making a trip there anytime soon. Maybe. I mean, it sounds for if
I
I
think
was
it's
in the
definitely worth visiting.
I
Everyone should go there before it gets touristy like Iceland.
yeah, if I were a meat eater, I'd say, well, maybe not. Maybe the tofu version. But how about the spices? The spices still taste the same?
Oh yeah, I would say so because one of these women that I talked to, she actually managed to start a Filipino grocery store in near the airport of the Faroes. So she's been able to import all the mamacita products and everything like that.
Mamacita. Yeah, and Mang Tomas and Datu Puti, I bet,
Yep,
right?
all that.
They got the Datu Puti.
Mhm.
And I guess there's no shortage of bagong either.
There's definitely bagong. And I mean, I guess they could make it there if they tried. The GDP of the Faroes is 90% from fish. So I'm sure there's plenty of product you can make it with.
Yeah, they don't need to import their bagong for goodness sakes. But
Mhm.
all right, well, listen, I've enjoyed talking to you about the Filipino flavors. To get us back to Filipino Americans, what would you say? Here's one thing I want to ask a food writer about Filipino Americans, because this is a part of our history, and it's the connection between diet, food, and health. And one of the reasons I'm vegan is because, my father loved pork. He died of a heart attack. If I loved pork like he loved pork, I'd soon be on the same path.
Mhm.
We're talking about uh, everything from heart disease to diabetes. How does a food writer, at what point does a food writer say, okay, I love all this food, I'm writing about all this food, but at some point there needs to be not, maybe not necessarily limits, but there needs to be a kind of conscious consumption of these foods to, for self-preservation at the very least. No.
Mhm. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, as a food writer, I feel like I write more about people than food, really. So, there's other writers who are doing better work with talking about nutrition and the issues involved in our American consumption patterns. But I mean, in my own personal advocacy, I've always tried to talk more about the side of Filipino food that's not this deep fried, pork heavy, generally unhealthy cuisine, which I really think is the cuisine of the capital of Manila. It's not at all the way people eat in the rest of the Philippines. The way people eat in the countryside of the Philippines, generally speaking, is very healthy. I mean, they eat things like mongo, they eat a lot of pulses, which is similar to like dal in India that everyone talks about being so healthy. They eat loads of vegetables and fish. And I really think that the more Filipino restaurateurs can turn people to this regional, country based, vegetable forward cuisine, the healthier Filipino Americans can be, because the average Filipino restaurant in America does focus on pork and deep fried things. But I do see more high end Filipino restaurants in America and elsewhere starting to focus on this healthier kind of food. For example, leaving the United States, but in Argentina, there's a wonderful restaurant called Cantina Sune, and it started by actually a woman of American and Korean descent who really found home in Pampanga. And she cooks wonderful vegetable forward food, regional dishes from all over the Philippines. And she's introducing Argentines to that and making it quite popular. I think the same thing could happen in the United States.
Yeah, and the
I
beef, the beef industry is so big in Argentina,
did.
you'd figure there'd be some resistance to that, but it's good to see they're doing that. I've only seen one. Well, there's some vegan Filipino food trucks,
Mhm.
certainly, around the Bay Area. I've noticed, and in LA, and there was that one restaurant that I mentioned out in South San Francisco. I hope it's still in business, and they have vegan lechon, which is, you know, you can get your fat from other sources, from non-animal sources, besides the pig, and then, you know, uh, make it into something that replicates a lechon. It's amazing, and the salsa, the sauce you eat with it makes it makes it almost you can't even tell the difference. But anyway, look, I do appreciate coming on, Jennifer. Congratulations on your awards, and I just think that I I I want to ask you one last question, and that is, what is your favorite Filipino food? That's an easy one. And what did they have halo halo wherever you found it out in, the far flung regions where you traveled?
Oh yeah, halo halo is one of my favorite things. I mean, I kind of feel personally akin to it as someone who is also mixed up. But halo halo is one of my favorite foods, I think. One of my favorite Filipino foods. And one of the best I've had was in Budapest in a wonderful little
Budapest.
shop.
Did,
Yeah.
did they put paprikas or paprika in there?
No, no, they don't. That would be interesting. But pretty much everything in the halo halo there is homemade because there's not a large Filipino community in Hungary. So the woman who owns this coffee shop had to make the ice cream herself. She had to make the preserves herself. It's delicious. Yeah, and my second favorite Filipino food, or my favorite savory Filipino food, would probably be bitter melon salad, which is a dish that I learned in Capiz when I interned there as a college student. And I hated bitter melon before. I mean, I love vegetables, but bitter melon was just too much for me. But they make it there by slicing the bitter melon very thin and then taking out the pith, of course, and marinating it raw with onions and tomatoes in equal parts vinegar and sugar. And that combination really neutralizes the bitterness, and it's so fresh and delicious. It's one of my favorite things to eat. And that's
Uh,
super healthy.
yeah, it's funny you mentioned the bitter melon because there's a restaurant in Washington D.C. You may have heard of it, Bad Saint,
Yeah, sure.
right? And Tom Kinanen, the chef there, had this bitter melon dish that he it was his homage to his mom who was dying of cancer. He said that this is what helped. I don't know if she's still alive, but it kept her going. And he cooked it for me once. I sat there on the counter, and all the while I was in DC, I just kept going back,
Hmm.
stood in line, had that had that bitter melon dish, and I've never really had it replicated quite the way he prepared it, but it made me. I've always been a bitter melon fan a little bit, but
Mhm.
it all depends on how it's prepared, right?
Right. So how was it prepared there?
Well, it's a kind, as I recall, it's a kind of like a hash. It's sautéed, and it.
With eggs?
Pardon me.
With eggs?
I think there might have been. I might have had the special dispensation from the vegan gods
Okay.
that day, or that week that I was here. But it was just tasty, and it was as vegetarian as you're gonna get in a place like. I think you could get it without the eggs, and that's how I ate it. But you know, Filipino food, you go in there, it's almost like a death for Filipinos or death for vegans.
Yeah, no, it's not. You just have to get the right things. That's what I'm going to make tonight, actually. Yeah, just travel down south, see how much vegetables people eat, and ask them to hold the fish sauce, and you'll find a lot of vegan dishes.
Right. Hold the fish sauce. That's a
Right.
good vegan phrase. Okay. Well, look, Jennifer, I'm going to continue on talking about one last thing, but you spent some good time with us here on the FANHS museum pop up. So I'll let you go from the Zoom. So um, thank you very much. Congratulations on the two Plaridel Awards, and we'll have you back to talk about food on our Sunday brunch.
That'd be great. Thanks so much for having me.
Yeah, you're welcome. You're welcome. You're welcome to stay too. I'm just going to talk about the Celine Archive. Have you heard of the Celine Archive?
No, I haven't. I think I'm just going to watch the space so I don't have to look at my face anymore.
Okay, well, I mean, some of the viewers out there would say, "No, keep her on. It's better than looking at a meal all this time." But no, all right, do what you will. I just want to, I'll just make myself. I'm just put it in speaker view, and then she'll be little on the top there, and I'll be big. But look, I thank Jennifer, and she was a fellow Plaridel Award winner. I'll put in the box links to her story and my story. Our stories are one. I guess we both won too. We're double winners. There are a couple of double winners, and that's That's a good thing. And as I said, the Plaridel Awards are important because journalists we're the first draft of history. And when people will go back to see, well, what were they thinking? What were they thinking about this issue or that issue? They're going to go to the Filipino newspapers and the Filipino magazines and the Filipino news sources. And that's going to be their primary source in lieu of anything else. And that's what makes journalism the first draft of history much more than just the first draft. So, in closing today, you'll go to the FANHS Facebook page and you might notice a thing called the Celine Archive. It's a new documentary out by Celine Shimizu. She's a Filipino American who teaches at San Francisco State. And it's about this woman who was also known as Celine, but her official name is Cecilia Navarro. It's a fascinating film. It's a fascinating story. And the FANHS Museum is holding an online discussion a week, next Saturday at 1:00 on Halloween. And it's perfect for Halloween because it's kind of like a ghost story. This woman, Celine Navarro, or Cecilia Navarro, was buried alive. She had witnessed something. She was kidnapped. She was beaten, left for dead. And then they went to dump their perpetrators, the alleged perpetrators, went to dump the body, buried her alive. And it has been the source of Filipino ghost stories since the 1930s. The event happened in 1932. There was a big trial in 1933, and it was the subject of headlines throughout the country, or actually throughout the world. I don't know if they had papers in the Faroe Islands, but certainly they had papers in Denmark and in Britain that covered the trial in 1933 that took place in the Bay Area, I believe in Contra Costa County, because Celine, aka Celine, her real name Cecilia Navarro, was buried alive in the Delta of Stockton. She lived in Stockton, was part of her story is a Stockton story. And that's what's fascinating, because the story goes that Celine was either an adulteress or she witnessed something, and she actually testified against people who did something, a crime against a woman. She testified against them. She broke what had been known as or seen as a vow of secrecy amongst the community to correct that injustice that she saw. In fact, some people went to jail based on her testimony. And then after that first trial, she was a marked woman. And she was then kidnapped and brought before a group, this fraternal organization, Di Masalang in Stockton. And things happened to her there that is really part of her story. That is her story, right? The revenge of a community as opposed to the support of a community. And mind you, this is in 1932, where women were not very numerous, because if you recall, they came over from the Philippines in ratios of men to women, about 14-1. And so you hear a lot about the men's story, the worker story, the men who came over to work the fields. You hear very little about the women. And that's really what makes Cecilia Navarro's story fascinating, because it's this woman who initially stood up to a cultural organization, a fraternal organization, testified against them, and then was kidnapped, and then they had their way with her and punished her for breaking the community silence. They thought she was dead. They went to bury her. There was a big trial about, over the perpetrators, but they were acquitted, apparently. The news stories were sensational. It was seen as bad publicity, and no one wanted anything to do with the story. I mean, Filipinos were fascinated by it, but throughout the country, most Filipinos who were fighting waves of anti-Filipino sentiment were just trying to tamp it down. Because you remember, this happened in 1933, right? Or the actual crime or the event was 1932, but the trial was in 1933. 1934, the Tidings-McDuffie Act was passed, which essentially repatriated Filipinos who came to America as nationals, changed their status to Filipino aliens, and it was a different ballgame from Filipinos from 1934 on. That's something that isn't really mentioned much in the film, the Celine Archive, and it's something that's worth discussing. How did this play out in the media? How does this play out in the broader political narrative of Filipinos here in America? Because we know what happened in Stockton. People did not want to talk about the story in Stockton. And to this day, just like Celine was buried, the story was buried, and now it's coming out. Now it's beginning to come out because Professor Shimizu, Celine Perennias Shimizu, who made the documentary, is now showing it at film festivals around the country. It's causing a buzz, and for a lot of different reasons. I think if you are a family member of Celine Navarro, you want a sense of closure. But what if you're a family member of the perps who got away, from the folks at Dimasalang who participated? And what about their descendants? Is there shame? Do they even know about the story? They're not really mentioned in the film, but it's an important part of the story. The film gives closure to the victim and talks about women, but what is the role of the film in service to the truth in terms of what really happened to the community, to Filipinos in general because of this story? What happened overall in terms of, well, we know justice was not, there was no justice for Celine. Her murderers got away. And in fact, one historian, Rick Baldoz, who's in the film, talks about how Celine should be seen as a hero for speaking out. So there's a lot of things in this story to unpack. If you go to our webinar link, there's a way to see the movie if you'd like. It's I think there's a small cost to see the film ahead of the discussion, but there's certainly things to discuss about the film because, as I said, now there's a little opening, a little bit of interest, so we can discuss these things. So definitely check it out. It's on the FANHS, FANHS Museum, the Facebook page, FANHS Museum Facebook page. There's a little link that you can get, sign up, free RSVP to our discussion that'll take place next Saturday at 1 o'clock Pacific. And we will do that instead of having our virtual pop-up. We'll have a lengthy discussion there. Professor Shimizu, San Francisco State, the filmmaker, she'll be there talking about the film. We'll have members of the Navarro family will be there. And we'll also have Dorothy Cordova, the executive director and founder of FANHS, the Filipino American National Historical Society. She'll be present. I'll be moderating. I'm just full of questions. I don't have any answers, but I think that's one of my, I think the film is very emotional. Um, and for the Navarro family, I think there's a certain sense of closure. But what do you say about a film that begins with questions and ends with more questions? There's a little bit of closure emotionally for the family, the Navarro family, but there's still lots to talk about this story that has been really buried since the 1930s. So join us, go to that FANHS Facebook page, the FANHS Museum Facebook page, RSVP for the free webinar. We'll talk about it. And that's it. Today we celebrate Larry Itliong's birthday. Happy birthday, Larry. And I guess we'll have a Filipino, let's see, Jennifer, you're still with us, right?
I'm still here.
Birthdays. I'm wondering, what did they do for my, I guess we had a cake. I guess we had some momon or something. What, we didn't really have a piñata growing up. That's kind of a Mexican thing, but what did you do anything special for your birthday?
We always had pancit and a lechon when I could afford it.
Oh, yeah, that's right. Lechon, you had okay, that we had some lechon. I guess that's always,
vegan, even gluten-free.
but there's always going to be a lechon kind of thing. But all right, yeah. I guess, all right, so we lift up a toast to Larry. Happy birthday, Larry Itliong, October 25th, from Pangasinan, Filipino icon. We'll also put down a bunch of those links to the writings of myself and Jennifer, who also went to Playerdale. That's it. See you next week. I'm Emil Guillermo, the museum director of the Filipino American National Historical Society Museum. My gong in the place of our little Filipino American symbol in the back. Just couldn't get the virtual thing working today. But have yourselves a great Sunday. Thank you for attending the Sunday brunch. Thank you, Jennifer.
Thank you for having me. It was great.
Yeah, and we'll see you again next week until like they say, there's a very famous children's show host in San Francisco who always ended his shows as he would say, "See you subsequently." That's what he would say. And I said, "What the?" He gave us an SAT word. We don't even need it. We're just like 5 years old. We don't need it. Anyway, thank you very much for joining us. Have yourselves a great day on Larry Itliong's birthday.